Number 4, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead despite their having every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation that the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number 1, their leader was dead, and Jews had no belief in a dying, much less rising, Messiah. 2, according to Jewish law, Jesus' execution as a criminal showed him out to be a heretic, a man literally under the curse of God. And 3, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead before the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe in and were willing to go to their deaths for the fact of Jesus' resurrection. Dr. Lüdemann himself agrees that a historical investigation takes us back to the abrupt origination of the Easter faith of the disciples. So in summary, there are 4 facts agreed upon by most scholars who have written on these subjects, which any adequate historical hypothesis must account for: Jesus' burial by Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. The question is, how do you best explain these 4 facts? Well, that leads me to my second contention. The best explanation of these facts is the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead. C.B. McCullough, the historian, in his book Justifying Historical Descriptions, lists 6 tests which historians use in determining what is the best explanation for given historical facts, such as explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, not being ad hoc or contrived, being in accord with accepted beliefs, and outstripping its rival theories. The hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead passes all of these tests. Number 1, it has great explanatory scope. It explains why the tomb was found empty, why the disciples saw post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and why the Christian faith came into being. Second, it has great explanatory power. It explains why the body of Jesus was gone, why people repeatedly saw Jesus alive despite his earlier public execution, and so forth. 3, it is plausible. Given the historical context of Jesus' own unparalleled life and claims, the resurrection serves as a divine confirmation of those claims. 4, it is not ad hoc or contrived. It requires only one additional hypothesis, namely that God exists. And even that needn't be an additional hypothesis if you already believe in God's existence. 5, it is in accord with accepted beliefs. The hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, does not in any way conflict with the accepted belief that people don't rise naturally from the dead. The Christian accepts that belief just as wholeheartedly as he accepts the belief that God raised Jesus from the dead. And 6, it far outstrips any of its rival theories in meeting conditions 1 to 5. Down through history, various rival hypotheses of the facts have been offered. For example, the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. Such hypotheses have been almost universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. No naturalistic hypothesis has attracted a great number of scholars. But if that is the case, then why, we may ask, does Dr. Lüdemann reject the resurrection hypothesis in favor of his own preferred hallucination hypothesis? Well, I think the answer is very simple. The resurrection is a miracle, and Professor Lüdemann denies the possibility of miracles. He states, and I quote, "Historical criticism does not reckon with an intervention of God in history," end quote. And thus you see the resurrection cannot be historical. It goes out the window before you even sit down at the table to look at the evidence. So, what justification does Dr. Ludemann give for this crucial presupposition that miracles do not happen? Well, in his writings, all I could find was a couple of one-sentence allusions to Hume and Kant. He says, Hume demonstrated that a miracle is defined in such a way that no testimony is sufficient to establish it. The miraculous conception of the resurrection, he says, presupposes a philosophical realism that has been untenable since Kant. But Professor Ludemann's procedure here is all too hasty. Thomas Morris, a philosopher, comments in his book, Philosophy and the Christian Faith, what is particularly interesting about the references theologians make to Kant and Hume is that most often we find the philosopher merely mentioned, but we rarely, if ever, see an account of precisely which arguments of his are supposed to have accomplished the alleged demolition. In fact, I must confess to never having seen in the writings of any contemporary theologian the exposition of a single argument from either Hume or Kant or any other historical figure for that matter, which comes anywhere near to demolishing historical Christian doctrine or theological realism. Hume's argument against miracles was already refuted in the 18th century by Paley, Less, and Campbell, and most contemporary philosophers also reject it as fallacious, including such prominent philosophers of science as Richard Swinburne and John Ehrman, and analytic philosophers like George Mavrodes and William Alston. Even the atheist philosopher Antony Flew, himself a Hume scholar, admits that Hume's argument is fallacious as it stands. As for philosophical realism, well, this is the dominant view among philosophers today, at least in the analytic tradition. So if Dr. Ludemann wants to reject the possibility of miracles on the basis of Hume and Kant, then he's got a lot more explaining to do. Otherwise, his rejection of the resurrection hypothesis is based on a groundless presupposition. Reject that presupposition, and I think it's pretty hard to deny that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation of the facts. Now, of course, Dr. Ludemann does offer an alternative explanation, the hallucination hypothesis. He develops an elaborate theory based upon the depth psychology of Carl Jung concerning archetypes in the collective unconscious, which he believed Peter and Paul to have projected as external visions or hallucinations. And he thinks that these were brought on by guilt complexes that Peter and Paul suffered under independently. Now, in our book, I try to show that this hypothesis, though ingenious, does not, in fact, pass those 6 tests for being the best explanation. But for now, we can note that if Dr. Ludemann's only reason for preferring it to the resurrection hypothesis is that the resurrection is a miracle, then this amounts to nothing more than a philosophical prejudice against miracles. So, in conclusion, then, we've seen first that there are 4 established facts to be explained: Jesus' burial, his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And second, that the resurrection hypothesis meets the tests for being the best explanation of these facts. The question then which remains is whether Dr. Ludemann can offer us an hypothesis which better meets those same criteria.